5 days before my sister's wedding, I received a PDF bearing my forged signature. $100,000 was just the surface of a scheme to make me their lifelong wallet. My father planned to mock me during his toast. Completely oblivious that their financial foundation was already crumbling, I decided to wait. I would let them step onto the stage, laugh, and believe they had won before I pulled the floor out from under them entirely. My name is Maya Clark. I am 34 years old, and I make my living pulling structure and order out of absolute chaos. As the founder and chief executive officer of Blackwater Restoration Group, a commercial property restoration firm based right here in Charlotte, I am intimately familiar with disasters. I have stood inside the gutted remains of corporate high-rises after electrical fires. I have waded through flooded hotel lobbies after Category 4 hurricanes. My entire professional life is built on assessing damage, calculating loss, and forcing stability back into broken foundations. But no collapsed roof or shattered load-bearing wall could have prepared me for the quiet, devastating structural failure waiting in my inbox on a humid Tuesday afternoon. The office was silent except for the low hum of the central air conditioning. I had just finished reviewing a 50-page structural integrity report when the email notification chimed on my second monitor. The sender was Helena Vale, the mother of my sister's fiancé, Everett. Helena and I had only spoken a handful of times, mostly exchanging polite pleasantries at awkward engagement dinners where she evaluated my family's pedigree and I paid the exorbitant check. The subject line of her email was entirely blank. The body contained a single, chillingly polite sentence. Maya, could you please confirm if this gift is final? Attached to the brief message was a portable document format file labeled simply as a gift letter. I clicked it open, rubbing the bridge of my nose, expecting it to be a final invoice for the caterer or perhaps an upgraded floral arrangement they wanted me to approve. Instead, I found myself staring at a legally binding declaration of a major financial transfer. There, sitting starkly at the bottom of the glaring white page, was my signature. According to the dense legal text above it, I was gifting $100,000 to cover the remaining wedding expenses. That part, unfortunately, was true. I had agreed to that ridiculous sum months ago, bullied into it by a barrage of guilt trips and tearful pleas, but my eyes snagged on the paragraph immediately following that initial sum. The second clause stated, in unequivocal legal jargon, that I was providing an additional $150,000 as a non-refundable financial gift for my sister, Sloane Clark, and her soon-to-be husband, Everett Vale. The document explicitly detailed that these funds were earmarked for the down payment on their new estate, and that the wire transfer would be executed immediately following their 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives. I stopped breathing. The air in my office felt suddenly thin, as if the room had been vacuum sealed. $150,000. I had never agreed to such a thing. I had never even entertained a passing conversation about buying them a house. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes darting back to the signature at the bottom of the page. It was mine. The loops of the M and the sharp angle of the C were undeniably my handwriting, but it was perfectly flat. There was no variance in ink pressure, no slight drag of a pen tip. It was entirely too perfect. Then, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the old digital signature template I had saved on the flatbed scanner at our family home 4 years ago. I had created it when I was untangling a massive property tax dispute for my father, a mess that nearly cost us the house. Someone had gone into that machine, retrieved my saved digital file, pasted it onto a fraudulent mortgage document, and submitted it to a banking institution. Before the sheer cold panic could fully crystallize into blinding rage, my cell phone vibrated violently across the surface of my mahogany desk. The caller identification flashed my father's name, Dale Clark. I picked up the device, my chest tight, my knuckles turning white around the casing. I had just come off a grueling 3-week stretch, overseeing a massive warehouse recovery project on the coast, operating on barely 4 hours of sleep a night. A normal father might call to ask if I was resting, if I had eaten a decent meal, or if I was simply surviving the workload. Dale did not possess those instincts. He bypassed any form of greeting entirely. "Maya," he barked, his voice carrying that familiar, demanding edge that always made my shoulders tense. "You need to wire the extra funds to the florist by 5 o'clock today. They are flat out refusing to release the imported white hydrangeas without the final 30% clearing their accounts. And the jazz band needs their deposit bumped up immediately. The Vale's value class, Maya. We cannot look like we are cutting corners on the brass section just because you are dragging your feet." I sat frozen, listening to the heavy, expectant rhythm of his breathing on the other end of the line. He was spending my money with the casual, arrogant entitlement of a man who firmly believed he had minted the currency himself. While he was still talking, demanding action and speed, my phone screen lit up with a rapid-fire succession of text messages from Sloan. I pulled the device away from my ear just enough to read the incoming notifications. "Please tell me you handled the venue upgrade." The first message read, "Everett's uncle is flying in all the way from London." The second message arrived a second later. "This wedding is not just a happy day for me, Maya. It is a turning point for the whole family. We have to look the part." The final message was the anchor. "Do not let us down." There it was, the classic, undeniable Clark family maneuver. Weaponizing my bank account under the heavy, suffocating guise of family duty, they were expertly framing a grotesque luxury that I was funding as a fundamental moral obligation that I owed to their social standing. I placed the phone back against my ear. Dale was now rambling about the unacceptable quality of the standard champagne flutes the hotel was offering. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level, burying the tremor of fury deep in my chest, "I am currently reviewing all the final paperwork and bank statements. I will not authorize any further wires or sign off on any additional vendor upgrades until I have gone through every single document and personally confirmed the numbers." A brief, heavily loaded silence hung on the line. The temperature of the conversation dropped instantly. "What exactly is there to review?" he snapped, his tone shifting from aggressively demanding to sharply defensive. "It is a wedding, for God's sake, not a hostile corporate merger. Stop treating your sister's special day like a forensic audit. Just call the bank and send the money." "I will look over the documents," I repeated, my voice stripping away any remaining room for negotiation or debate. "Then we will talk." I ended the call before he could wind up for another manipulative guilt trip. I sat alone in the quiet expanse of my office, the ambient noise of the city outside muffled by the thick glass windows. I needed to think with absolute clarity. I needed to understand the exact architecture of this deception. If Helena Vale was emailing me directly to ask for confirmation, it meant she had physically seen the letter. If she had seen the letter, it meant the document was already in motion within the banking system. The closing on their new house was entirely contingent on my fictional generosity. Later that evening, the final, damning piece of the puzzle fell right into my lap. I was sitting on my living room sofa, staring blankly at a muted television, nursing a heavy glass of bourbon, when a group message pinged loudly on my phone. It was from Dale. The text read verbatim, "Just keep Maya happy and distracted until the end of the reception. Once the vows are done and the house closes on Monday morning, the rest of the funds will flow exactly where we need them to. Do not let her look too closely at the vendor contracts." The message was immediately followed by a digital contact card for the luxury wedding planner they had hired. He had sent it to me by mistake. In his arrogant haste, he had meant to text the wedding planner directly, but his clumsy thumbs had selected my name in his recent contacts instead. A cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity washed over me, chilling me down to the marrow of my bones. This was not just a case of an entitled bride getting carried away with a massive budget and a designer vision board. This was not merely a foolish father trying to show off to his wealthy, connected in-laws. This was a calculated, deliberate, and legally actionable financial setup. My own flesh and blood had forged federal mortgage documents. They had hijacked my identity and stolen my signature. They were actively, knowingly conspiring to drain my accounts. assuming with breathtaking audacity that my lifelong habit of cleaning up their endless messes would naturally extend to covering up massive real estate fraud. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the burn ground me in the present moment. If I confronted them right now, screaming into the phone and waving the forged PDF document in their faces, I knew exactly how it would play out. Dale would immediately gaslight me. He would call me hysterical and paranoid. Sloane would turn on the theatrical tears, claiming I was trying to ruin the happiest week of her life out of bitter, lonely jealousy. They would effortlessly spin the narrative, painting me to the Vales and everyone else as the cruel, rich spinster sister who was maliciously sabotaging a beautiful wedding over a petty misunderstanding. I could not afford to just be angry. Anger was sloppy, and anger left room for interpretation. I needed to be surgical. If I was going to cut this parasitic bond, I had to sever it so cleanly, and with such overwhelming, undeniable proof, that neither my father nor my sister would ever be able to reattach themselves to my life or my assets again. I walked over to the kitchen sink and poured the remainder of the expensive bourbon down the drain. The time for being the reliable, silent, and endlessly forgiving checkbook was officially over. I walked into my home office, opened my laptop, and began to dig. When I was 20 years old, the floor completely gave out beneath us. My mother had only been gone for 6 months, her absence still a raw, gaping wound in our daily lives. When my father managed to incinerate what was left of our stability, Dale had been running a mid-sized regional construction firm, but he possessed a fatal combination of massive ego and terrible impulse control. He took on high-risk commercial bids he could not possibly fulfill, leveraged our personal assets to cover the compounding shortfalls, and ultimately drove the company straight into a brick wall of insurmountable bad debt. The aggressive bank notices started arriving in thick, certified envelopes. Foreclosure was no longer a distant, abstract threat. It was a hungry wolf sitting directly on our front porch. I was a sophomore in college at the time, studying structural engineering with a full academic schedule. I packed my dorm room into cardboard boxes on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, formally withdrew from all my classes, and drove back to a house that felt exactly like a sinking ship. Someone had to bail the water. My father was paralyzed by his own monumental failure, spending his days sitting in a darkened living room, nursing cheap domestic beer and loudly cursing a world he claimed had intentionally rigged the game against him. Sloane was only 18, utterly insulated from the practical panic, crying solely because we could no longer afford her out-of-state university housing deposits. I did not have the luxury of crying. I put on heavy steel-toed boots and took a job on a commercial disaster response crew. It was brutal, bone-crushing labor. My first deployment was to a coastal town shredded by a late-season hurricane. I spent 12 to 14 hours a day tearing out soaked drywall, dragging mold-infested carpets out of flooded basements, and breathing in the sour, toxic stench of ruined homes. My hands blistered until they bled, thick calluses eventually forming over open wounds. But while I swung a sledgehammer, I also watched everything around me. I learned exactly how the insurance adjusters calculated catastrophic loss. I studied the intricate, bureaucratic dance between property owners, federal relief funds, and restoration contractors. I saw precisely where the real money was made in the chaotic aftermath of a disaster. I started taking night classes in insurance adjusting and commercial safety compliance. I would finish a grueling physical shift, wash the fiberglass insulation out of my hair in a cheap motel shower, and stay awake until 3 or 4 in the morning studying federal building codes and structural mitigation strategies. That relentless, sleep-deprived grind was the absolute bedrock of Blackwater Restoration Group. I built my company dollar by exhausting dollar, turning a tiny freelance cleanup operation into a highly profitable commercial enterprise over the course of a brutal decade. My first major financial milestone was not buying myself a luxury vehicle or a designer wardrobe. It was rescuing my father. The bank was weeks away from physically seizing the family home, the only place that still held the lingering ghost of my mother. I took every single cent I had managed to save. leveraged my newly formed corporate credit, and created a blind limited liability company. Through that hidden entity, I bought the distressed property directly from the bank, effectively paying off my father's catastrophic arrears. But I knew Dale. I knew his fragile, toxic pride could never withstand the deep humiliation of knowing his college dropout daughter was officially his landlord. So I lied to his face. I told him a private investment firm had purchased the debt and was willing to let him stay on a highly favorable lease agreement. He bought the fabricated story without a second thought, eager to believe he had simply caught a lucky break from the universe. For years, he has lived under a roof that I own, sleeping in a house that I salvaged, completely oblivious to the fact that I am the sole reason he is not sleeping in a rented motel room. And my financial hemorrhage did not stop at the property line. As Blackwater grew and became successful, so did the financial demands of my family. I paid Sloane's entire undergraduate tuition, ensuring she could attend the prestigious private university she felt she inherently deserved. When she graduated and immediately racked up $25,000 in revolving credit card debt, funding a lifestyle she could not afford, I quietly zeroed out the balances. She cried, called me her absolute savior, and promised to change her habits. 6 months later, she decided she wanted to be an entrepreneur. She launched a bespoke lifestyle brand selling overpriced organic linen loungewear. It was a spectacular, entirely predictable failure. I absorbed the $40,000 loss when her suppliers threatened to sue her for breach of contract. I wrote the checks because they were my family, and because a younger, more desperately naive version of myself genuinely believed that if I provided enough of a safety net, they would eventually learn to walk the tightrope on their own. I was devastatingly wrong. My silent sacrifices did not breed gratitude. They bred a monstrous, unchecked entitlement. Worse still was the narrative my father actively spun to cover his own glaring inadequacies. At neighborhood barbecues, holiday dinners, and country club gatherings where he played golf on borrowed guest passes, Dale would hold court. He would drape an arm around Sloane and proudly declare her the refined, highly educated jewel of the family, a girl destined for high society. Then, his gaze would slide over to me. He would shake his head with a practiced, deeply affectionate condescension. He told everyone I was the stubborn one, the college dropout who just did not have the polish for corporate boardrooms. He painted me as a blue-collar workaholic, a rough woman who only knew how to bury her head in dirty construction sites because I lacked the sophistication for anything else. I let him tell those lies. I sat quietly at the edge of the patio, sipping my ice water, letting him rewrite our family history to protect his fragile ego. I accepted the role of the unrefined, hardened laborer because I convinced myself that keeping the family unit intact and fully funded was far more important than receiving public credit. I thought my silence was an act of profound, unconditional love. But silence is a terrible teacher. By never forcing them to acknowledge the crushing weight I carried for them, I taught them that the weight did not actually exist. Every utility bill I paid, every property tax installment I covered, every one of Sloane's catastrophic financial messes I erased became the invisible, assumed baseline of their existence. My money was no longer viewed as a generous gift or a hard-earned resource. It was a natural phenomenon, expected to fall on them whenever they experienced a drought. If I ever attempted to set a basic boundary, if I ever gently suggested that Sloane needed a strict budget or that Dale should cut back on his luxury expenses, I was instantly branded as selfish. I was viciously accused of throwing my financial success in their faces. Now, standing in the shadow of this wildly extravagant wedding, the final, agonizing truth has become impossible to ignore. I am looking back at 14 years of grueling labor, 14 years of prioritizing their comfort over my own life, and I realize they do not love me. They have not loved me for a very long time. I am no longer a sister. I am no longer a daughter. To Dale and Sloane, I am nothing more than an emergency municipal infrastructure. I am a highly efficient, perpetually open funding system that they believe they have an absolute divine right to tap into whenever their ambitions exceed their bank accounts. and they resent me deeply for the simple, infuriating fact that they need me to survive. They took my silent endurance as weakness. They mistook my fierce loyalty for stupidity. They thought my love for them was a blank check they could write forever. They are about to find out exactly what happens when the bank finally closes the account. The wedding was not a celebration of love or the joining of two families. It was a hostile corporate takeover dressed up in white silk and imported lace. Sloan had selected Ashbourne House for the venue, a sprawling, historic estate dripping with Spanish moss located in the heart of Savannah. The initial budget she and Everett presented had been aggressively optimistic, barely covering the cost of renting the grand ballroom for a single evening. Within 3 weeks of signing the initial contract, their imaginary budget had completely evaporated, and the relentless stream of luxury upgrades began to flow directly to my inbox. Every single extravagant detail went through me. I was the one who authorized the rush delivery fee for the White Garden roses flown in directly from a boutique farm in California. I paid for the private champagne tasting bar because Sloan decided standard sparkling wine was too pedestrian to serve to her new in-laws. The 4-piece string ensemble hired to play during the ceremony, the 10-piece jazz band secured for the reception, the photographer who insisted on shooting exclusively on vintage film stock, and the antique silver convertible booked for their grand exit. All of it rested squarely on my shoulders. Even the luxury villa for their 2-week honeymoon was secured with a massive hold on my corporate credit card. The wedding planner, a remarkably efficient woman who specialized in managing demanding brides, never emailed Sloan first when a vendor deadline loomed. She emailed me. It was not out of a sense of professional respect or courtesy. It was a cold, calculated business decision. She knew perfectly well that while Sloan was the one curating the mood boards and demanding visual perfection, I was the only person in the room capable of actually clearing the heavy invoices. I was not the sister of the bride to her. I was the central bank funding a small, heavily leveraged nation. The true depth of their contempt for me became undeniable when the final seating chart arrived in my inbox for a mandatory review. I opened the document expecting to see my name placed at the main family table, seated next to my father and directly facing the sweetheart table where Sloan and Everett would sit. Instead, I had to scan the intricate diagram twice before I finally located my assigned seat. I was not placed at the head of the room. I was relegated to a circular table pushed far off to the side, positioned awkwardly near the kitchen swinging doors and the secondary bar. The table was explicitly labeled for special patrons, a grouping that included the wedding planner's assistant, the lead photographer, and a few distant relatives from the groom's side who had responded to the invitation at the absolute last minute. I was being seated like an anonymous corporate sponsor who had bought a mid-tier ticket to a charity gala. I was the person paying for the entire room, yet my physical presence was deemed too unrefined to sit in the center of the aesthetic masterpiece I had purchased. Sloan made sure to micromanage my appearance as well. 2 weeks prior to the event, she had called me while I was driving back from a structural site inspection. She explicitly requested that I wear a dark, muted navy gown. She told me my usual style was a bit too sharp and structured for the romantic, ethereal vibe she was trying to achieve for the cameras. She actually used the word soft. She needed the wedding photos to look soft, and my presence apparently threatened to disrupt her carefully curated visual narrative. She wanted me there to pay the bill, but she wanted me faded into the background, a dark blur on the edge of the frame that would not pull focus from her perfect day. My father was equally busy managing the public relations side of their financial heist. During a logistical conference call, I was silently copied on. I listened to Dale instruct the master of ceremonies on exactly how to introduce the evening toasts. He specifically requested that the announcer casually mention how the Clark family always supports each other. It was a brilliantly manipulative piece of scripting. By framing the entire extravagant affair as a collective family effort, he was preemptively taking public credit for my money. He wanted Everett's wealthy relatives to look at the imported flowers and the flowing champagne and believe that the Clarks were a powerful, unified front of generational wealth, with me acting merely as a proud, compliant contributor. Everett, for his part, remained entirely cordial and blissfully ignorant of the machinery operating beneath him. He cornered me near the hotel lobby the afternoon we arrived in Savannah. He was wearing a tailored linen suit, looking every bit the relaxed, confident groom. He shook my hand, gave me a warm smile, and thanked me for being so incredibly generous with the vendor deposits. He told me he knew Sloane had expensive taste, but he promised they would make it up to me once they were settled into their new life. He was perfectly polite and completely unaware that he was thanking me for a massive financial commitment I had never actually made. He had been fed the sanitized fairy tale version of the story. He genuinely believed I was a willing, enthusiastic participant in this elaborate production. But the most chilling aspect of the entire weekend, the detail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, was the casual, terrifying certainty with which everyone spoke about the house. Every conversation in the hotel corridors eventually circled back to the closing scheduled for Monday morning. Helena Vale mentioned how excited she was to help Sloane decorate the sunroom. Dale bragged to the valet parking attendants about his daughter's massive new estate in the suburbs. Everett talked about the landscaping projects he wanted to tackle before winter arrived. They were all talking about Monday morning as if it were a fixed point in time, an absolute, unbreakable guarantee. They were discussing renovations, paint colors, and expensive furniture deliveries for a property that hinged entirely on a sum of $150,000 that I had never promised, never authorized, and never intended to give them. My family had constructed an entire alternate reality, a towering monument to their own greed, built entirely on the fragile foundation of my forged signature and stolen identity. I sat alone in the lobby lounge, nursing a glass of iced, sparkling water, watching them all laugh and clink crystal glasses together. They were celebrating a victory they had not earned, spending money they did not have, and living in a future they had stolen from me. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. They were not just taking advantage of my bank account anymore. They were actively writing massive checks against my life, entirely confident that I would simply fold under the social pressure and cover the deficit rather than cause a scene in front of polite society. They were banking on my silence. They were relying on my deeply ingrained habit of protecting them from the devastating consequences of their own actions. They thought they had finally backed me into a corner where my only option was to nod, smile, and wire the requested funds. But as I watched my sister twirl in her designer rehearsal dress, and my father hold court at the center of the room, I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over me. The resentment that had been simmering in my chest for over 14 years had finally burned off, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. I was not going to save them this time. The stage was beautifully set. The wealthy guests were arriving, and the illusion was perfectly intact. I would let them have their beautiful, flawless weekend. I would let them drink the expensive champagne I bought and dance to the jazz music I funded. And then, when the lights were at their brightest and the entire audience was watching, I was going to pull the floor out from under them. I did not confront my father or my sister. Instead, I made a phone call to June Mercer. June was not the kind of attorney who handled gentle family mediations or drafted simple wills. She was a ruthless corporate litigator who treated every contract like a loaded weapon and viewed every financial discrepancy as a potential crime scene. I paid her substantial retainer fee by an immediate wire transfer and forwarded the fraudulent document straight to her secure server. June did not waste a single second. She instantly brought in an independent digital forensics specialist she kept on priority standby for corporate espionage cases. Within 48 hours, they had completely dissected the portable document format file down to its most microscopic metadata, and the results read exactly like a criminal indictment. Sitting across from June in her austere, glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, I listened to the forensic specialist explain the exact anatomy of my family's betrayal. The signature on the file was not merely traced. It was a flattened, high-resolution digital image, precisely cropped from a specific commercial tax addendum I had signed 3 years prior. The body of the gift confirmation had been clumsily spliced together using a standard commercial banking template available on the internet, but the most damning evidence was the digital footprint they left behind. The file had been uploaded and transmitted to the mortgage broker from a secondary, unlisted email account belonging to the wedding planner. However, the Internet Protocol address used to access that specific account at the exact time of the transmission traced directly back to a residential internet router located just down the street from my father's house. They were physically sitting in his neighborhood, likely in his own living room, when they actively committed federal wire fraud, but that single forged letter was merely the bait on the hook. June used the threat of an immediate federal injunction to subpoena the entire pending mortgage file from the lender when she laid the massive, printed dossier on my desk. The air completely left my lungs. Buried beneath the standard loan applications and credit checks were crisp copies of my personal income declarations and 2 full months of my private bank statements. They were slightly outdated documents, likely pulled directly from the locked filing cabinet in the home office that Dale still had physical access to, but they were more than enough to satisfy a lazy underwriter. My family had not just forged a single desperate letter. They had systematically and quietly harvested my private financial identity to construct a flawless profile of an undeniable, infinite funding source for their new luxury estate. While I was still reeling from the profound invasion of my personal records, June delivered the next devastating blow. She had run a comprehensive, deep-dive background check on my father's current financial standing. The man who was currently holding court down in Savannah, loudly boasting to anyone who would listen about his daughter's massive new property, was actually drowning in a sea of hidden toxic debt. He owed massive back payments on local property taxes. He was severely delinquent on his exclusive country club membership dues, the very place he used to maintain his wealthy facade. Most disgustingly of all, he had recently taken out a predatory, high-interest, hard money loan. To secure that desperate cash advance, he had used a restored vintage wooden boat as collateral. That specific boat was a passion project I had entirely funded 2 summers ago. I had poured tens of thousands of dollars into custom mahogany hull repairs and engine overhauls just to give him a peaceful retirement hobby. He had literally pawned my heartfelt gift to keep up his fraudulent social appearances. June and I then meticulously reviewed the foundational legal paperwork for the house Dale was currently living in. The blind limited liability company I controlled still held absolute, uncontested ownership of the property. Dale held nothing more than a heavily restricted, deeply generous residency agreement. He possessed absolutely no legal authority to leverage the property. He had no right to claim it as a generational family asset, and he certainly had no right to promise its equity to anyone else. He was essentially a subsidized tenant playing the grand role of a feudal lord, using my hard-earned money to build a massive moat around a castle he did not even own. We then pivoted our attention to the Savannah disaster. June combed through every single vendor contract the luxury wedding planner had executed over the past 6 months. The boutique catering company, the imported floral arrangements, the historic venue rental, the vintage getaway car, the 10-piece brass band. Every single legally binding document contained a final guarantor clause hidden in the fine print. Because Sloan and Everett had virtually no liquid assets to their names, the planner had cleverly and maliciously structured the agreements so that my corporate credit card and my personal name stood as the ultimate, inescapable backstop. If I pulled my funding at the last minute, the legal responsibility for the remaining massive balances would instantly and violently snap back onto the bride, the groom, or whoever had signed as the secondary party. They had built an extravagant, towering house of cards, and they had arrogantly designated me as the only load-bearing pillar, fully believing I would never dare to step out of the way and let it collapse. The final revelation, however, was the twist that shifted my entire perspective on the situation. I had originally assumed Helena Vale was simply a cautious, wealthy mother-in-law doing her standard due diligence when she emailed me that Tuesday afternoon. But June, being the relentless investigator she was, managed to get Helena on a private, off-the-record phone call. Helena, it turned out, was not just a bored society matron. Before marrying into the old Vale family money, she had spent 15 grueling years working as a senior risk underwriter for a major commercial bank. When Sloane had proudly shown her future mother-in-law the gift letter as concrete proof of the Clark family wealth, Helena's dormant professional instincts had immediately flared to life. She told June the phrasing in the document was entirely wrong. It was too perfectly standard, reading exactly like a textbook example of a constructed financial instrument rather than a genuine, heartfelt letter written by a loving sister. The font spacing was slightly off, and the boilerplate language was a massive red flag. Helena had instantly smelled the fraud, but she needed me to confirm it without officially tipping off Sloane and causing a preemptive panic. She had inadvertently handed me the exact weapon I needed to defend myself, perfectly wrapped in a polite email. Sitting across from June, completely surrounded by the undeniable, printed evidence of my family's breathtaking treachery, the very last shred of my familial loyalty completely evaporated into the cold air conditioning of the office. I understood right then that merely canceling the checks and walking away would not be nearly enough. If I simply refused to pay and quietly left town, Dale would orchestrate a masterclass in public victimhood. He would tell the Vales and all their wealthy friends that my commercial business was secretly failing, or that I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown, or that I was simply a cruel, jealous spinster actively trying to ruin his golden child's happiness. To permanently shatter this suffocating dynamic, I could not just prove to a bank that I was being used. I had to publicly, legally, and irrefutably prove to everyone in that ballroom that my father and my sister were active, malicious architects of their own fraud. They had intentionally built a luxurious prison out of my money, and I was going to lock the doors and burn it to the ground with them inside. I arranged to meet my sister for lunch at a high-end bistro downtown. It was exactly the kind of pretentious, overpriced establishment she favored, where the menus lacked prices and the portions were aggressively small. I arrived at noon, taking a seat at a quiet corner booth. When Sloane finally walked in 20 minutes late, she was a vision of bridal radiance, completely unbothered by the suffocating humidity outside. She slid into the booth across from me, ordering a glass of expensive sparkling water before even glancing in my direction. I decided to give her one final opportunity to confess. I wanted to see if there was a single shred of genuine sisterhood left beneath the layers of entitlement. I kept my voice incredibly soft, devoid of any accusatory edge, and mentioned the email I had received from Helena. I asked her directly about the gift letter and the forged signature. I expected panic. I expected tears. Or perhaps a sudden, desperate apology. Instead, Sloane casually reached for a piece of artisan bread. She did not even blink. She waved her hand dismissively, letting out a soft, patronizing laugh. She told me it was nothing more than a soft formality. According to her twisted logic, the mortgage broker simply needed a placeholder document to appease the underwriters and keep the file moving forward. She leaned across the table, her eyes narrowing slightly, and told me I was overreacting. She said I always had this desperate need to control every minor detail of her life, and she begged me not to ruin her happiness over a meaningless piece of paper. I maintained my composure, though the sheer audacity of her lie made my pulse hammer against my ribs. A soft formality does not magically generate a legally binding commitment for an additional $150,000, I reminded her. I asked her point blank why that specific, massive number had been added to a document I had never seen, let alone authorized. The practiced, bridal softness vanished from her face instantly. Her posture stiffened, and her tone turned sharp and deeply resentful. She dropped the piece of bread back onto her plate. She looked at me not as a sister who had just been caught committing fraud, but as a wealthy tyrant who was being unreasonably stingy. She told me that rich people always make a huge deal out of small numbers. She actually called $150,000 a small number. She argued that since my company was pulling in massive commercial contracts every single quarter, I should not be interrogating her over an amount that I would barely even notice missing from my corporate accounts. Before I could fully process the absolute delusion of her statement, a heavy shadow fell over our table. I looked up to see our father looming over us. Sloane had clearly texted him the moment I brought up the letter. Summoning her primary defender to shut down the interrogation, Dale did not bother to sit down. He stood there, his face flushed with a mixture of midday alcohol and aggressive indignation. He planted his hands firmly on the edge of the table, leaning into my space to deliver his verdict. He told me, his voice a harsh, furious whisper, that I needed to remember my exact place in this dynamic. He pointed a thick finger at my face. "You are not the bride," he spat out, his words dripping with venom. "And you are certainly not the groom and his family, who actually need to maintain their face in polite society. You are useful when you are silent. Do you understand me? You are useful when you simply do what is required and keep your mouth shut." I sat there, perfectly still, absorbing the brutal honesty of his words, but he was not finished. He decided to deliver the lowest, most vicious blow he could muster to ensure my compliance. He looked me up and down with profound pity. He told me that since I had spent my entire adult life failing to build a family of my own, the absolute least I could do was step aside and let Sloane have a start worthy of her class. He actually used the word class. The man who had pawned my gift to pay a loan shark was lecturing me about class, using my single status as a weapon to demand my money. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the two of them, standing united in their shared delusion, and realized there was nothing left to save. I stood up, placed a $50 bill on the table to cover the untouched drinks, and walked out of the restaurant without saying another word. By 4 p.m, I was back in my hotel room, methodically packing my suit for the rehearsal dinner, when my phone rang. It was Everett. Given the explosive lunch I had just endured, I assumed he was calling to do damage control on behalf of his hysterical bride. I answered with a guarded, neutral greeting, but Everett did not sound angry or defensive. He sounded genuinely relieved and overwhelmingly grateful. He called specifically to thank me for stepping up for the closing. He told me that Sloane had just informed him that I had personally smoothed over a minor banking delay, ensuring the keys to the new house would be handed over to them first thing on Monday morning. He went on to say how lucky he was to be marrying into a family that supported each other so fiercely. I listened to his sincere gratitude, carefully dissecting his words. It became instantly clear that Everett was not the mastermind behind this massive deception. He was absolutely aware that a house was being purchased, and he knew my money was involved, but he had been fed a completely sanitized, highly curated version of the truth. He had no idea about the forged signature. He had no idea that the gift letter was a fabricated document, or that the funds were being extracted from me under duress and outright fraud. He was simply a naive passenger who thought he had won the lottery, completely unaware that his bride and his future father-in-law were actively robbing the bank to buy the winning ticket. I realized then that while Everett was not completely innocent in his willingness to accept such a massive handout, he was not my primary target. He was just another prop in their elaborate stage play. I told him I would see him at the rehearsal, my voice betraying absolutely none of the storm brewing inside me. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Savannah skyline and cast long, dark shadows across my hotel room, I held a final, decisive phone conference with June. She had spent the entire afternoon maneuvering through back channels and reviewing banking regulations. The strategy was set in stone. June confirmed the exact sequence of events we needed to execute. If I formally submitted a legally binding document revoking the supposed gift and simultaneously filed a declaration of forgery regarding the mortgage file, the entire financial mechanism would instantly halt. If we timed the submission perfectly, submitting the documents just before the funds were scheduled to be disbursed for the closing, the bank would be legally obligated to freeze the entire transaction. They would freeze the escrow account, halt the transfer of the deed, and immediately launch an internal fraud investigation. There would be no last-minute reprieves. There would be no secret wire transfers to cover the gap. The money they were counting on to solidify their new, luxurious life would vanish into thin air, locked behind a wall of federal banking regulations and criminal inquiries. I instructed June to prepare every single piece of paperwork. I told her to hold the final submission until I gave her the explicit signal. I was going to let my father give his grand speech. I was going to let my sister bask in the glow of her stolen wealth. And then, I was going to burn their entire fantasy to the ground. I did not waste another ounce of energy feeling betrayed. Betrayal is an emotion, and emotions have absolutely no place in a systematic corporate dismantling. I returned to my suite at Ashbourne House, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and opened my encrypted work laptop. For 14 years, I had operated as the crisis management team for my family. I had absorbed their panic, shielded them from the consequences of their profound incompetence, and quietly paid the catastrophic bills. But a true chief executive officer knows exactly when a subsidiary is no longer viable. My family was a toxic asset, and I was initiating a complete and total liquidation. My first target was the digital infrastructure they had so arrogantly relied upon. I logged into my primary commercial banking portal. Over the past 6 months, the luxury wedding planner had meticulously linked my platinum corporate card to every major vendor account, setting up automatic withdrawals for the final balances scheduled to hit over the weekend. With a few deliberate surgical keystrokes, I disabled every single automatic charge. I then enacted a strict security protocol on the account. From that exact second forward, not a single penny could be moved without a direct two-factor authentication code sent exclusively to my personal cell phone. If the florist tried to pull the final 20%, the transaction would instantly decline. If the jazz band attempted to process their massive overtime deposit, they would hit a solid brick wall. The invisible, endless pipeline of money was officially shut off. Next, I opened my email client. I needed them completely relaxed, entirely convinced that their vile lunch ambush had worked and that I was back in my obedient, silent role. I drafted a brief, perfectly polite message to the wedding planner. I confirmed my full attendance for the entire weekend schedule. I even added a cheerful note at the end, casually mentioning that I was looking forward to the reception and was fully prepared to say a few words when the time came for family toasts. It was the perfect decoy. I knew the planner would forward that email directly to my sister and my father, confirming to them that the difficult bankroller had been successfully pacified and brought back into line. My secure phone line buzzed softly on the desk. It was June. She had the final legal arsenal prepared and ready for my authorization. She read through the 3 distinct documents she had drafted with lethal precision. The first was the formal, legally binding revocation of the supposed financial gift, officially notifying the lending institution that no such funds would ever be transferred to the bride or the groom. The second was a sworn, notarized affidavit stating unequivocally that my signature on the mortgage file was a fraudulent, unauthorized forgery. The third document, however, was my personal favorite. It was a formal notice of termination regarding my father's favorable residency agreement. June had structured it flawlessly. Dale was essentially being served a legally binding eviction notice from the very house he loved to pretend he owned. The grand illusion of his generational estate, the lie he used to bolster his fragile ego at the country club, was about to evaporate into thin air. I hung up with June and immediately dialed the chief accountant at Blackwater Restoration Group. For years, I had authorized a steady, quiet monthly transfer to my father under the absurd guise of a consulting retainer. It was a face-saving mechanism, a way for him to receive a substantial allowance without feeling like a charity case. I instructed my accountant to sever the retainer permanently, effective immediately. The massive transfer scheduled for the first of the month was canceled. There would be no severance package. There would be no final grace period. He had bitten the hand that fed him, and now he was going to starve. With the digital and financial lifelines completely severed, I needed physical armor. I connected my laptop to the high-speed printer sitting on the suite's mahogany desk. I printed out the entire fraudulent mortgage dossier, every single page of the forged gift letter, the damning digital forensics report, and a comprehensive spreadsheet detailing every wedding vendor contract that held my name as the ultimate guarantor. I collated the heavy stack of papers and bound them into a thick, undeniable physical file. I knew exactly how my family operated. The moment the trap sprang, they would immediately resort to their favorite defensive tactic. They would call me emotional. They would scream that I was being hysterical, crazy, or deeply jealous of my sister's beauty. But they would not be arguing with a crying, defensive sibling. They would be arguing with an absolute mountain of black and white legal evidence. There was one external variable I needed to secure before the evening began. I requested a brief, completely private meeting with Helena Vale in the hotel's secluded garden courtyard. Helena arrived looking immaculate but deeply concerned. I did not give her the entire agonizing history of my family's dysfunction, but I gave her enough facts to understand the gravity of the situation. I confirmed her worst professional suspicions about the banking documents and informed her that a massive, catastrophic financial reckoning was going to take place during the reception. Helena was a woman who understood the ruthless mechanics of money and the severe consequences of federal fraud. She agreed to attend the dinner in absolute silence. She promised to sit at her designated table and watch the evening unfold, only stepping in to speak if my family attempted to corner me, and I was forced to reveal the ugly truth to the entire room. She was my silent, highly credible witness from the groom's side. My final piece of architecture required a face-to-face conversation with the actual venue. I walked down to the executive offices of Ashbourne House and sat across from their senior financial director. He was a stern, meticulous man who dealt with wealthy, difficult families every single weekend. I laid my corporate card on his desk and explained the situation with cold, surgical precision. I informed him that I was the sole guarantor for the grand ballroom, the exquisite catering, and the luxury bar packages. I told him that at a very specific hour later that evening, I would be formally and legally withdrawing my financial guarantee for the remainder of the event. I instructed him that the moment I gave the signal, the hotel was not to wait until Monday morning to sort out the missing funds behind closed doors. I wanted him to send his collections manager directly down to the ballroom floor to demand immediate payment from the bride and the groom. I wanted the harsh financial reality to crash into their perfect fantasy right in the middle of their opulent celebration. The director looked slightly shocked by the sheer brutality of the request, but he recognized a titanium-clad corporate mandate when he saw one. He agreed to the terms without hesitation. I walked back up to my suite, my steps echoing quietly on the thick carpet of the hallway. For the very first time in my entire adult life, I was not running frantically toward a crisis trying to build a dam before the water destroyed my family. I was the one opening the floodgates. I had spent over a decade acting as their human shield, absorbing their mistakes, and paying for their monumental arrogance. I had built a highly successful company from the ground up, only to be treated like an automated teller machine by the people who shared my blood. But the era of my silent servitude was over. I had carefully, methodically constructed a flawless trap, built entirely out of their own greed and their absolute certainty that I would never dare to fight back. I stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling, manicured lawns of the estate, feeling an incredible, icy sense of peace. I was not going to save them this time. I had designed this crisis to land exactly where it belonged, and I was going to watch them drown in it. The rehearsal dinner was held on a sprawling rooftop terrace overlooking the slow, dark current of the Savannah River. The evening air was thick and heavy with coastal humidity, pressing down on the guests like a physical weight. Waiters in crisp linen drifted through the crowd, offering trays of seared scallops and crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. It was an impeccably curated scene, designed to project an image of effortless generational wealth. I stood near the edge of the terrace, a cool glass of sparkling water anchored in my hand, observing the social machinery operating around me. My father was entirely in his element. He moved from group to group, clapping the Vale patriarchs on the shoulder, laughing entirely too loudly at their polite jokes, and acting every bit the seasoned patriarch himself. He was wearing a custom tuxedo that I had unwittingly paid for, funded through the monthly consulting retainer he had been draining from my company for years. He looked prosperous. He looked exactly like the man he desperately wanted the world to believe he was. Halfway through the evening, the low murmur of conversation was interrupted by the sharp ringing of silver against crystal. Dale stood at the head of the long banquet table, raising his glass high into the warm night air. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward him. He began with a sweeping, emotional tribute to Sloane. He called her the absolute light of the family, a beacon of grace and elegance, who was finally stepping into the magnificent life she was always meant to live. He spoke about her refined taste, her gentle spirit, and how she was a perfect match for a family as distinguished as the Vales. Then, with a practiced, sweeping gesture, he turned his gaze toward me, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He offered the room a tolerant, slightly weary smile. He told the assembled guests that our family functioned as a perfect, balanced unit. He said, and I quote his exact words, that Maya handles all the dry paperwork and the wire transfers, but Sloane is the one who actually brings beauty into this world. A ripple of soft, knowing laughter washed over the rooftop. It was not a malicious roar, but rather a polite, collective chuckle from a group of wealthy individuals who found the dynamic charming. That gentle sound was far more devastating than a scream. In that single, unified laugh, I saw the exact, inescapable box my father had built for me. I was not a daughter to be cherished or a sister to be loved. I was a purely utilitarian mechanism. I was the rough, unpolished machinery operating below deck, shovel in hand, feeding coal into the furnace so they could stand on the upper deck in their fine clothes and admire the beautiful view. The guests saw me as a willing, practical workhorse, entirely devoid of the refinement necessary to be truly valued. Before the sting of the toast could fully settle, Sloane materialized beside me. She looped her arm through mine, leaning in close under the guise of sisterly affection. Her perfume was overwhelmingly sweet, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating look in her eyes. She pulled me slightly away from the main gathering, toward the dimly lit corner near the elevator bank. She did not bother to thank me for the extravagant dinner we were currently attending. Instead, she issued a direct, unapologetic directive regarding the wedding day media strategy. She told me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, that I needed to make a conscious effort to step out of the frame when the professional videographers were circling the dance floor. She explained that she was trying to build a very specific aesthetic for her social media audience. She said her followers expected a certain type of romantic, ethereal content, and that my presence was simply too rigid. She actually looked me in the eye and stated that her audience preferred a softer energy, and that I was practically ruining the visual flow of her most important life event. I was paying the staggering invoices for the photographers, the drone operators, and the vintage film editors, yet I was being explicitly instructed to erase myself from the physical record of the day, because my mere existence did not fit her fraudulent brand. I nodded slowly, offering her a blank, unreadable expression, and walked away toward the terrace bar to get a glass of actual liquor. I needed a moment to breathe. I stepped behind a massive, decorative column woven with climbing ivy, inadvertently placing myself in the direct acoustic shadow of a private conversation. My father was standing a few feet away, engaged in a low, intense discussion with the luxury wedding planner. I stood perfectly still, letting the ambient noise of the party mask my presence. They were not talking about the floral arrangements for the next day. They were discussing a timeline that extended far beyond the weekend. I distinctly heard the planner refer to a strategy she called Phase 2. Dale enthusiastically agreed, mentioning a coastal cottage property they had recently scouted. He then casually dropped a detail about a lucrative joint investment portfolio he was setting up with Everett's uncle. My blood ran entirely cold. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen as I drafted a rapid, highly secure message to June Mercer. I told her to immediately expand her digital sweep of the wedding planner's communications, specifically searching for any documents or memos referencing a Phase 2 or a joint venture with the Vale family. I spent the next 45 minutes trapped in agonizing small talk with a distant cousin of the groom, all while waiting for June to respond. When my phone finally vibrated against my leg, I excused myself to the luxury restroom suite, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. June had found the smoking gun. It was a preliminary investment memorandum, drafted by the planner acting as an unofficial broker, and emailed directly to the Vale uncle who managed their family trust. The document outlined a highly ambitious commercial real estate venture, but the most horrifying detail was the listed collateral. Under a section labeled as anticipated capital contributions from the Clark family, they had explicitly listed my primary logistics warehouse property. It was a massive, highly profitable tract of commercial land located in the suburban outskirts of Charlotte. It was the very crown jewel of my corporate portfolio, an asset I had secured through years of brutal, exhausting negotiations. My family had brazenly offered up my commercial real estate as a bargaining chip to buy their way into the Vale family's inner financial circle. The sheer, breathtaking scale of their predatory ambition finally crystallized in my mind. This was never just about a single, forged gift letter for $100,000. The fraudulent mortgage for the new house was merely the opening move in a much larger, infinitely more destructive game. They were actively constructing a permanent, high-capacity pipeline designed to siphon off my capital, my corporate credit, and my hard-earned assets to fund Sloane's luxurious new reality and Dale's pathetic delusions of grandeur. If I simply canceled the vendor checks tomorrow morning and quietly drove back to Charlotte, it would be a temporary inconvenience for them. Dale would immediately spin a tragic, compelling story to the Vales. He would paint me as a mentally unstable, wildly jealous spinster who had a sudden, dramatic breakdown. He would play the victim flawlessly, and within 6 months, they would undoubtedly find another covert angle to attack my assets. They would never stop, because they fundamentally believed my wealth was their birthright. Staring at my own reflection in the gold-rimmed mirror of the restroom, the last lingering trace of familial obligation burned away into nothing. A quiet, terrifying resolve settled into my bones. A temporary tantrum would not save me. Withdrawing my funding quietly in the shadows would not protect my future. I realized that the upcoming reception could not merely end with a canceled check. It had to end with a total, spectacular, and completely public execution of their access to my life. I had to sever the limb entirely, and I had to do it in front of the exact audience they were trying so desperately to impress. Only a complete, devastating public humiliation would ensure they never dared to reach into my pockets again. The sun rose over Savannah with a heavy, oppressive heat, baking the historic cobblestone streets before the clock even struck 8 in the morning. I was already awake, sitting in the high-backed armchair of my suite, watching the dust motes dance in the slanting light. My phone vibrated against the glass coffee table, the screen illuminated with a message from Sloane. It read, simply and sweetly, that today she just needed me to be her sister. It was a perfectly crafted sentiment, the kind of message one might screenshot and post online to prove familial devotion. Exactly 45 seconds later, a second message arrived. It was a forwarded invoice from the jazz ensemble, accompanied by a blunt demand for me to authorize an additional $3,000 for their overtime performance fee. The breathtaking whiplash between manufactured sisterly affection and raw financial extortion did not even make me blink. I simply locked the screen and set the device aside. I walked over to the heavy mahogany wardrobe and unzipped my garment bag. I was not going to wear the soft, muted, ethereal gown Sloane had explicitly demanded. I had brought a tailored, razor-sharp, dark navy suit. It was woven from heavy, imported wool, structured with aggressive shoulders and clean, unforgiving lines. It was not the attire of a compliant, fading background character meant to blur into the romantic scenery. It was the armor of a chief executive officer stepping into a hostile boardroom. As I fastened the cuffs and adjusted the lapels in the full-length mirror, I recognized the woman staring back at me. She was no longer the exhausted sibling desperately trying to hold a fractured family together. She was a woman arriving to finalize a total corporate liquidation. At 9 o'clock sharp, my secure line rang. It was June. She confirmed that the formal revocation of the gift letter had been officially uploaded to the lender's secure portal. However, we had agreed on a very specific tactical delay. June had configured the banking system so that the absolute irreversible trigger for the document would only activate after I made my public declaration. I refused to let Dale or Sloane control the narrative by claiming I had snuck around behind their backs to ruin them in secret. I wanted the legal guillotine to drop in the exact same moment the social one did. Every single move I made was going to be entirely transparent, legally sound, and completely undeniable. Simultaneously, my corporate accountant executed the final internal protocol back in Charlotte. A company-wide memorandum was distributed to the executive team and the security staff at Blackwater Restoration Group. It permanently revoked every single symbolic ounce of access my father possessed. His virtual private network credentials, his building keycards, and his legacy expense accounts were entirely wiped from our servers. He was now a complete stranger to the company he loved to pretend he had a hand in building. I left my suite and descended the grand staircase toward the lobby, moving quietly through the frantic, pre-wedding chaos. Near the entrance to the bridal preparation suite, I caught a glimpse of a rapidly deteriorating situation. Helena Vale was standing in the alcove, her posture rigid, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone to her son. I could not hear every single word, but I saw the exact moment the color drained from Everett's face. Helena was quietly warning him. She was fulfilling her promise to me, subtly tipping off her son that the financial foundation of this marriage and the impending house closure was built on fraudulent, unstable ground. Everett immediately turned and knocked on the heavy oak door of the bridal suite. I stepped back into the shadows of the corridor, watching the scene unfold. When Sloane appeared in the doorway, already half-dressed in her extravagant silk gown, Everett asked her a direct, hushed question about the bank documents. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely predictable. Sloane did not offer a rational explanation. She immediately burst into violent, theatrical tears. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and loudly sobbed that I was trying to sabotage her. She wailed that I had a pathological need to control other people's lives, and that I was twisting innocent paperwork just to punish her for being happy. I watched Everett's face. He looked torn, his brow furrowed in deep, agonizing confusion. He patted her back, trying to calm the storm, but his eyes were entirely hollow. He was trapped. He was standing in a rented tuxedo, hours away from walking down the aisle in front of 200 wealthy guests, facing a weeping bride who was masterfully playing the victim. He knew something was fundamentally wrong, but he did not yet possess the concrete, physical evidence required to halt a production of this massive scale. Without the smoking gun directly in his hand, he chose the path of least immediate resistance. He kissed her forehead, whispered something reassuring, and walked away. The wedding was going to proceed, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The air was no longer filled with joyous anticipation. It was pulled as tight as a piano wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. During the late afternoon ceremony in the estate's sprawling gardens, I took my assigned seat in the secondary row. I sat perfectly still. I did not glare at my father when he walked Sloane down the aisle. I did not scoff when they exchanged their vows about honesty and eternal partnership. I maintained a neutral, entirely unreadable expression. My absolute silence was the final, necessary ingredient in their delusion. Whenever Dale glanced in my direction, he saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a daughter who had been successfully intimidated by the sheer social weight of the event. He saw a woman who had accepted her defeat, too embarrassed and too thoroughly cornered to cause a scene in front of polite society. They all believed that the immense pressure of the ballroom would force me into permanent submission. As the sun set and the guests transitioned into the gilded, magnificent reception hall, I took my seat at the outcast table near the kitchen doors. The room was a dizzying display of opulence, practically suffocating in imported white roses and the golden glow of hundreds of floating candles. Waiters poured vintage champagne, and the 10-piece band played a flawless, lively set. I ate nothing. I simply watched the stage. I knew my father's psychology intimately. A man like Dale Clark cannot merely win in silence. He requires an audience to validate his triumph. He needs to stand in the spotlight and flex his perceived power. I knew he would not be able to resist the microphone. I knew he would use his toast not just to celebrate his daughter, but to publicly reinforce his dominance over me. There are certain predators in this world who only reveal their true, ugly nature when they are absolutely convinced that every single person in the room is standing on their side. I sat back in my chair, adjusting the sharp cuffs of my navy suit, and watched him confidently wipe his mouth with a linen napkin. He stood up from the head table, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and began walking purposefully toward the center of the dance floor. The band leader handed him the silver microphone. The entire ballroom began to quiet down, the clinking of crystal glasses fading into a hushed, expectant silence. The moment I had been waiting for all day had finally arrived. The stage was his. The audience was primed, and the floor beneath him was entirely made of glass. I waited for him to take the first swing. The reception ballroom at Ashbourne House was a staggering display of purchased reality. Gold leaf detailed the soaring ceiling, reflecting the warm, ambient light of crystal chandeliers down onto tables groaning under the weight of imported white floral centerpieces. Those arrangements stretched upward like massive marble columns, dominating the visual space. Waiters in pristine white coats glided silently across the polished hardwood dance floor, endlessly refilling crystal flutes with vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. I sat entirely alone at my designated fringe table near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, watching the relatives from the groom's side whisper in hushed, admiring tones. They looked around at the breathtaking, suffocating opulence and genuinely believed the Clark family possessed the deep, generational wealth required to comfortably fund such a masterpiece. They were admiring a highly expensive mirage. By the time the heavy, silver-covered main courses were cleared from the tables, my father had consumed at least 4 generous pours of premium single malt scotch. I could tell by the dark flush rising in his cheeks and the arrogant, loose roll of his shoulders as he pushed his chair back from the center of the head table. The 10-piece jazz band wound down their energetic set to a soft, lingering murmur as Dale strode confidently toward the center stage. He tapped the silver microphone twice, the sharp thud echoing through the vast space, demanding total silence from the hundreds of guests. He began his toast with the predictable, syrupy platitudes I had anticipated. He spoke grandly about how gentle and pure his youngest daughter was, painting Sloane as a delicate, rare flower who deserved absolutely nothing but the finest things life could offer. He nodded magnanimously to Everett, praising the groom for his successful career and graciously welcoming him into our fold. He raised his heavy crystal glass high into the air, declaring loudly that the two of them were destined to build a life of absolute class and societal distinction. The crowd was thoroughly softened by the expensive wine, the decadent food, and the warm, romantic atmosphere. They smiled warmly. They raised their own glasses in solidarity, murmuring their collective approval. And that was the exact moment my father decided he had garnered enough public support to finally put me in my place. He turned his body slightly, pointing his free hand toward the dark, recessed corner where I was seated in my sharp navy suit. A condescending, deeply patronizing smile stretched across his flushed face. He told the room that families are constructed from many different kinds of people. He said Sloane got all the grace and the beauty of the family line, while my path was admittedly a bit rougher. He casually, cruelly mentioned my lack of a husband, noting that my sharp edges and rigid personality kept me entirely alone. He brought up my incomplete university degree, seamlessly framing my grueling, exhausting decade of building a massive commercial empire as a desperate fallback plan for a woman who simply lacked natural, feminine softness. Then, he delivered the ultimate punchline. He leaned into the microphone and chuckled, his voice dripping with venomous pity. He told 200 wealthy guests that if he had to be completely honest, the only truly useful thing about his eldest daughter was her money. A few tables near the front of the room erupted into loud, genuine laughter. Other guests turned in their seats to look at me, their faces twisting into uncomfortable masks of awkward pity. I looked directly past them, fixing my gaze on the head table. Sloane was not looking down in embarrassment. She was not standing up to defend her older sister. She was sitting there, a serene, entirely complacent smile resting on her perfectly painted lips, basking in the warm glow of my public humiliation. They thought I would shrink. They firmly believed I would lower my eyes, quietly absorb the brutal public insult, and retreat into the shadows just like I had done for 14 long years. They banked their entire future on my lifelong habit of silent endurance. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly, violently against the floorboards. I stood up to my full height, carefully smoothing the front of my heavy wool jacket. I did not run. I did not storm across the room in a blind, emotional rage. I walked forward with the slow, measured, and terrifyingly calm pace of a woman walking into a corporate boardroom to formally fire a severely delinquent board of directors. The scattered laughter in the room began to falter and die out completely as I approached the stage. Dale looked confused for a fraction of a second, his smug smile faltering just slightly as I climbed the short set of velvet-covered stairs. He opened his mouth, perhaps to utter another patronizing joke to diffuse the sudden, heavy tension, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from his hand. His grip was loose, completely unprepared for any form of physical confrontation or defiance from his personal bank. I turned my back to him and faced the sea of wealthy guests, the glittering chandeliers, and the towering white flowers. The grand ballroom was now entirely silent, save for the soft, electric hum of the audio system. I did not tremble. I did not raise my voice a single decibel higher than a conversational tone. I looked dead center into the crowd, then shifted my piercing gaze to Everett, and finally let it rest heavily on Sloane. I spoke one single, perfectly articulated sentence. The $100,000 gift is canceled. The silence that immediately followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck all the air out of the massive room. The band leader, who had been softly brushing a snare drum in the shadowy background, froze completely. The ambient music died abruptly, leaving a ringing emptiness in its wake. Sloane shot up from her chair, as if she had been physically struck by lightning. The smug, radiant bride vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed woman staring directly at her impending ruin, her face drained of all color, matching the stark, pure white silk of her designer gown. Dale recovered his senses a mere second later. His initial shock violently morphed into explosive, defensive rage. He lunged forward, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He leaned aggressively toward my face, completely forgetting the massive audience watching his every frantic move. He hissed at me, his voice carrying the harsh, jagged edge of pure panic. He called me a selfish, bitter spinster. He told the room I was having a severe psychotic break because I was poisoned by jealousy over my sister's perfect life. He raised his voice higher, adopting the booming, authoritative tone he always used to bully me into submission behind closed doors, firmly believing that if he just yelled loud enough, the entire system would reset and I would fall obediently back into line. I did not argue with him. Arguing requires a fundamental desire to reach a mutual understanding, and I had absolutely no desire to understand him or accommodate him ever again. I simply stepped back, keeping the microphone positioned close to my mouth, refusing to yield the floor. I addressed the bewildered room a second time, my voice slicing effortlessly through his frantic, desperately loud insults like a steel razor blade through cheap fabric. I stated clearly, legally, and unequivocally that as of this exact minute, every single financial guarantee listed under my personal name or my corporate entity for the remainder of the evening was completely null and void. I announced that I was no longer backing the premium catering, the historic venue rental, the open luxury bar, or the live entertainment. I watched the exact moment the collective, horrifying realization hit the ballroom. The wealthy guests from the groom's side, the society friends my father had tried so desperately to impress, the vendors standing nervously near the perimeter walls. They all stopped looking at me like I was a jealous, erratic sister throwing a highly inappropriate family tantrum. They looked at my cold, unbothered expression, and then they looked at Dale's sweaty, panicked face, and the terrible, undeniable truth finally settled over the room. This was not a petty verbal argument over wedding etiquette. This was a catastrophic structural failure of their entire reality. They were witnessing the exact moment a living, breathing funding source reached out and viciously pulled the plug on the entire financial machine. The Clark family wealth was nothing more than an elaborate, fragile stage play, and I had just walked over and turned off all the stage lights. Dale stood frozen on the stage behind me, his mouth hanging open, grasping the empty air where his absolute power used to reside. The silence in the gold-plated room was no longer expectant or polite. It was the terrifying, breathless quiet that occurs right before a massive, structurally compromised building collapses entirely into dust. Dale completely lost whatever fragile grip he had on his fabricated reality. His face twisted into a mask of absolute, unhinged fury. The charming, sophisticated patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a desperate man watching his stolen empire crumble in real time. He grabbed the microphone stand, his knuckles turning white, and screamed across the dance floor that I could not possibly go back on my word in the middle of a wedding reception. He bellowed that our family does not operate like a cold legal contract, and that I was destroying my sister out of pure, malicious spite. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I simply unclasped the heavy leather portfolio I had carried with me and let it fall open on the nearest dining table. I looked right at his flushed, sweating face and told him that our family operates exactly like a series of calculated lies, and those lies finally came with massive invoices attached. I turned back to the room, projecting my voice clearly so that every single guest in the silent, echoing ballroom could hear the absolute truth. I announced that early this morning, my retained legal counsel officially filed a sworn declaration of forgery with their lending institution. I stated unequivocally that the gift letter buried inside Sloan and Everett's mortgage file was entirely fabricated. Because of that legal filing, the closing for their grand new estate scheduled for Monday morning had been formally flagged for severe fraud, and the entire escrow account was completely frozen. Right on cue. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The senior financial director of Ashbourne House walked straight onto the ballroom floor. He did not look like a man arriving to celebrate a union. He looked exactly like a corporate executive arriving to collect a massive, overdue debt. He stopped at the edge of the dance floor, cleared his throat, and confirmed my statement in front of both families. He announced loudly that the final balances for the historic venue, the premium catering packages, the 10-piece jazz band, and all extended service upgrades were currently unpaid. He looked directly at Sloan and stated that since my financial guarantee was legally and fully withdrawn, the hotel required an immediate alternative form of payment to keep the lights on for the remainder of the night. The collective gasp from the groom's side of the room was audible, but the execution was not over. June Mercer stepped out from the shadows near the entrance of the ballroom. She walked with the terrifying, measured pace of a seasoned litigator holding a winning verdict. She bypassed Sloan entirely and walked straight up to Dale. She handed him a thick manila envelope, slapping it firmly against his chest. I narrated the contents of that envelope to the entire room. I explained that it contained the immediate, permanent termination of his fraudulent consulting retainer. It contained the legal directive revoking every single ounce of access he held to Blackwater Restoration Group. Finally, I told him it contained the formal legal notice regarding his residency. I announced to his wealthy friends and the country club associates he had tried so desperately to impress that he did not actually own the grand family estate he loved to brag about. My limited liability company owned it, and his highly generous tenancy agreement was officially under immediate legal review. The illusion of the powerful, wealthy Clark family shattered into a million sharp pieces right there on the polished hardwood floor. But the final nail in the coffin came from the groom's table. Helena Vale rose slowly from her seat. The matriarch of the Vale family commanded absolute attention simply by standing up. She looked at her son, then looked at Sloan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Helena spoke with crisp, undeniable authority. She stated to the entire room that she was the one who originally sent the suspicious mortgage file to me. She told them her years of professional underwriting experience allowed her to instantly recognize that someone in the Clark family had used forged, fabricated documents to force her son into a massive financial commitment built entirely on stolen money. She refused to let her family be dragged into a federal crime by a woman who viewed marriage as a lucrative heist. Everett looked as though the floor had completely opened up and swallowed him whole. He slowly turned his head to look at his radiant, trembling bride. His voice was completely hollow, devoid of any warmth or love. He asked Sloane directly, in front of 200 silent witnesses, if she had actually forged her own sister's signature to steal $150,000. Sloane completely broke. The delicate, ethereal bride routine evaporated. She started sobbing hysterically, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. In her desperate panic, she immediately tried to throw someone else under the bus. She pointed a trembling finger at the wedding planner, screaming that it was all her idea. When the planner loudly denied it, Sloane whirled around and blamed Dale. Dale exploded, his veins bulging in his neck, screaming back at his golden child that he orchestrated the entire fraud simply to secure her future and maintain the ridiculous, expensive lifestyle she constantly demanded. They were violently tearing each other apart in the middle of their own extravagant stage. I did not let them derail the momentum. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the absolute final piece of evidence. I held up the printed investment memorandum. I told Everett and his family that this was never just about a single wedding or a down payment on a house. I read the Phase 2 strategy aloud. I exposed the fact that my primary logistics warehouse out in Charlotte was explicitly listed as an expected capital contribution for a future joint venture with the Vale family. I made it crystal clear that my father and my sister were not just trying to steal a lump sum of cash. They were actively building a permanent, high-capacity pipeline to drain my commercial assets, my corporate credit, and my hard-earned wealth for the rest of my natural life. That was the breaking point for Everett. He stared at Sloane as if he was looking at a complete stranger, a dangerous parasite wearing a white silk gown. He reached up to his tailored lapel, violently ripped off his expensive white rose boutonniere, and threw it onto the nearest dining table. He announced to both families that he was separating his finances effective immediately, and that his legal counsel would be handling the absolute entirety of the fallout. He turned his back on the weeping bride, walked briskly through the grand double doors, and left the reception before the first dance was ever announced. Dale stood frozen on the dance floor. He had lost everything. He lost his fake wealth, his public dignity, and the sheer power he held over me for 14 years. His friends were staring at him with open contempt. Sloane collapsed into a chair, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. She realized in that agonizing moment that she had not just lost her stolen luxury house and her lavish wedding. She had permanently destroyed her highly curated online image and the entire fabricated narrative she had sold the world about her perfect life. I gently placed the silver microphone down on the table. The heavy metallic clunk echoed through the breathless room. I looked directly into my father's defeated eyes, and then I looked at my sister's tear-stained face. I delivered my final statement with a voice as cold and hard as solid ice. You never wanted me to be family. You only wanted me to be a payment system. As of today, that system is permanently closed. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the wreckage I had meticulously engineered. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, my footsteps steady and unbroken. I walked out of the heavy wooden doors, leaving the silent, darkened room behind me, letting the entire story detonate brilliantly at the exact moment I stepped out into the warm night air. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.